My name is Michael Goldberg, and I'm the Executive Director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University. I also teach at Weatherhead in the business school, where I'm an associate professor teaching entrepreneurship. And we're thrilled to have Shaan Gandhi here today as part of our alumni entrepreneurship alumni speaker series. And Shaan connected with our colleague Todd Schwarzinger, who's our Chief Commercialization Officer, who's on the call, I guess, earlier this year. And it's been really wonderful to reconnect or connect, at least for the first time for me, with alums like Shaan that are doing work. And all of our sessions, for those who are joining for the first time, are student moderated. So Cindy Ho, who's also a recent grad on Sunday, graduating and is heading to med school in the fall, knock on wood or knock on something. And so Cindy will be moderating, but we really encourage all of you that are on here with us on Zoom or on Facebook Live to pose a question. This is going to be interactive. It's going to be Cindy's show to moderate, so you can either raise your hand and let Cindy know you have a question. You can put a question in the chat, and we really look forward to it. So with that, let me turn it over to Cindy. And Shaan, thank you again for making the time today.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today to the speaker series with Dr. Shaan Gandhi. Just a quick background, he is currently the principal at Northpond Venture at the Boston office. Previously, he was at Pyxis Oncology as a co-founder and president, and also at Longwood Fund as another principal. Before entering into the venture capital field, he attended Harvard Medical School and also got his MBA there as well. And Dr. Gandhi made his switch from medicine to capital venture because he was saying how he wanted to have an opportunity to create this large impact on a greater number of people, and thought this field was just right for him. And so nowadays he's had so many different opportunities and has really learned a lot after making the switch. And I was thinking maybe we can start off with just how his journey and background from medicine to capital venture went about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Cindy. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. It's been a bit of a topsy-turvy career progression to venture capital, and really it was powered by just my interest in, as Cindy said, having a bigger impact. I think all of us, when we go to school, when we embark on our careers, we all have something that we want to accomplish with our lives and with our careers. And for me, that was trying to help as many patients as possible by bringing new drugs, new therapies to patients that need them. And when you think about what that means about bringing new therapies to patients that need them, it's a pretty broad statement and can take on a whole host of different paths. And initially, when I was a 2007 grad of Case Western, I majored in biochemistry and chemistry and minored in economics. When I was, and as I was saying earlier, I was also part of the pre-professional scholars program at Case. So I had known from high school that I wanted to be in medicine, and at that time I'd wanted to be a physician. And medicine is a pretty significant way in which you can actually bring those therapies to patients who need them. You're doing it in a very direct and a very real way. You're seeing the patient in front of you, you're trying to diagnose what's going on, and then you try to devise a treatment plan that helps that person as best as you can. And for a long time, that's actually what I had thought would be my calling, that's how I would have that impact on patients by bringing therapies to them. But really the transformation of my career from clinical practice to venture capital really started in grad school. So after I graduated from Case, I was fortunate enough to win the Rhodes Scholarship to go to the University of Oxford to study cancer biology and to get a PhD at Oxford. And while I was there, my PI in the lab, he was obviously at Oxford, but previously was at Stanford University and was very, very involved in entrepreneurship, very, very involved in advising startups that were trying to develop new drugs, new diagnostics for cancer. And just hearing him talk about all of the challenges that those companies faced, the questions they were dealing with, and how broad their scope really was. Like, for example, there was a I don't think they're around anymore, but there was a company that he advised called Iconisys. They were based in Connecticut. And Iconisys was trying to develop an automated microscope to detect circulating tumor cells. Now, that's a really big area of research and really a big area of diagnostics and treatment in cancer today in 2020. But this was 2007, 2008. So they were very, very much on the leading edge of what it meant to be, what it meant to study circulating tumor cells. And so the more that I heard him talk about challenges they faced, what they were trying to accomplish, it really dawned on me that here's an area where I could have even a bigger impact, right? It's obviously being a physician, you are able to treat the patients in front of you, but the number of patients you're able to treat is limited by the time you have in your day, by the number of hours you have for your office, the number of patients that are on your list. And here there's this company, Iconisys, that's trying to revolutionize cancer diagnosis for millions of people, where their vision was that everyone who may have had a diagnosis of cancer would get their blood drawn every 3 months, every 6 months, and they would pick up circulating tumor cells. And depending on what they found and the composition of the cells that they identified, that would help their oncologists devise better treatments for them. So that kind of planted the seed for me of like, maybe there's something else out there in my career where I could have that significant impact. So came back to the United States in 2010, went to medical school, went to business school, and kind of explored this theme even more. And it was really in residency here in Boston at Mass General where I think that thought process really came to bear, and it really can be encapsulated by a particular story. So I started residency in 2015. I don't know how many of you know about immuno-oncology drugs, but they're a major drug class now in cancer treatment. The main purpose by which they work is that they basically train the immune system to attack cancer cells. Cancer cells have figured out a way to avoid the immune system clearing them, and so a lot of these immuno-oncology drugs basically retrain the immune system to recognize the cancer as foreign and thus eliminate it. And it's led to a massive sea change in how we think about cancer treatment, because for the first time, we're now being able to treat and even cure a lot of tumors and a lot of patients that otherwise we couldn't have helped before, because we're training the immune system to fight the cancer on its own. And so the first drugs that came onto the market under this new aegis of immuno-oncology was this drug called ipilimumab that was approved in 2011. There are two more drugs that are really significant: pembrolizumab and nivolumab. They were approved for use in 2013 and 2014. And so when I started residency in 2015, these drugs had just come onto the market. A lot of cancer patients really hadn't gotten them yet, or if they had, they'd probably gotten them because they were on a clinical trial for one of those drugs. And over the span of my residency training, from 2015 when I was a first-year resident to 2018 when I was a senior resident, I was a final year resident in internal medicine, I saw how those drugs really took hold of cancer treatment and really established themselves as the cornerstones of treatment in most fields of tumor biology, to the point where when I was a first year resident, I took care of a lot of patients in the hospital who were, it's sad, they were dying of their disease. And they were young, they were in their 30s, they were in their 40s, they had widely metastatic disease. There was nothing we could do for them. We had tried every imaginable regimen, and it wasn't working. And so we were basically caring for them and helping them have some comfort and some dignity in their final days. Fast forward 3 years, right? Still a resident. I go back to the same exact oncology floor that I served on when I was a first year resident. Now I was a supervisor. Those patients weren't there anymore because they had been cured, because they had gotten those immuno-oncology drugs, nivolumab, pembrolizumab, ipilimumab, many others now, and their diseases were stable or they were cured. And so they didn't actually have to come into the hospital. And so just kind of like stepping back and thinking like, look what just happened here. In the span of 3 years, we had gone from many tumor types being a death sentence for people, melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer, death sentences for people, to no more death sentence. Actually, people are getting cured. People are now living their normal life in 3 years. That's crazy that they were able to accomplish that in 3 years. And the more I reflected on it, the more I thought about it, I realized that, the people who had that impact, right? They had this ability to change thousands and thousands of patients' lives. It was the drug makers that did that. The people who invented these drugs were the ones that really had that impact. And so I reflected on a lot of experiences I had in education and in training. And I think this and many others really kind of cemented for me that idea that I could have a much bigger impact on patients' lives if I was much more involved in the actual development of the drugs themselves, rather than being the physician that prescribed the drug, but actually invent the drug in the first place. So once I came to that realization, then it became, this is 2018, kind of early 2018 at this point. Once I came to that realization, I was kind of coming into residency. I was thinking about, okay, what am I going to do next? Am I going to go do fellowship, probably in oncology if I had done fellowship, or would I practice as a doctor for a number of years before thinking about my next steps? And as I came to that decision point, I realized that I really should get involved in developing drugs and in developing novel drugs that the world needs to treat patients. And then obviously the very next question is, well, like, where should I go? Because I'm a third-year resident. I don't really know anything about how to make drugs. Where should I go get training so I actually know what I'm doing? And so it looked at a number of different opportunities in big drug companies and small drug companies. And I came to venture capital as the way in which I could learn the most about how drugs are made. The beauty of venture capital is that you see companies at various stages of development. You see a number of different business models, some that work, some that don't work, some that work better than others. You see a variety of tumor types. You see a variety of diseases, beyond oncology. There are obviously a whole host of other diseases that still need much, much better treatments. And through venture, I would get that exposure and have that really steep learning curve where I could learn as much as possible, and in as short a period of time as possible, about what makes a drug good, what makes a drug not good, how do you develop a successful drug that actually helps people. So I figured that out early 2018 and made the switch to venture right after I graduated from residency. And so it's been over 2 years now that I've been in the venture capital ecosystem, and it's been really fun. It's been hard. There's a lot to do. There are a lot of companies out there that need help. There are a lot of scientific ideas coming out of universities, such as Case, that could potentially become commercialized and could lead to a therapy that could help people. But it's so much fun. It's so much fun to see those ideas actually come to reality, watch a company grow over time, and watch an idea that was initially incubated in a lab actually turn into an actual drug product or an actual device that gets into the hands of patients and hopefully helps them. So that's a very long-winded answer, but it kind of demonstrates this. It took a lot of reflection, a lot of thinking, and to see like where could I see myself having the most impact.
Yeah, I think it's really cool seeing the thought process and how all the different steps in your past have kind of culminated into what this has become. And I guess kind of bringing it into the present stage with the whole COVID-19 situation that's going on. Any thoughts on that? How has that affected what you're doing and everything with that?
Yeah, it's definitely affected a lot of things. So a couple thoughts on COVID. One is it had, at least from our perspective at Northpond, so a little bit about Northpond. We're a $1 billion life sciences venture capital firm. We're based in Maryland as well as here in Boston. And our focus is on investing across the entire value chain ecosystem in life sciences. So a lot of our peer venture capital firms will invest primarily in therapeutics companies, and we do a fair number of those as well. But we also are interested in R&D tools and diagnostics as well. And we're really passionate about that because it's important to understand what experimental tools that are at our disposal in order for us to then think about what could a potential new treatment look like. We need to be able to ask the right biological questions so that we can get the answers we need in order to develop those drugs. So it's important to understand the tools and diagnostic space in order to understand the therapeutic space, and vice versa. By understanding what are patients' true needs, where are the true use cases in healthcare, you can then kind of think back and say, okay, what tools are needed? What research tools are needed in order to answer those questions? And so I think the biggest thing that we've noticed since kind of the explosion of the pandemic in March here in the United States is that a lot of people within venture capital, but even a lot of people outside of venture capital, have recognized the importance of diagnostics as a key component of our healthcare system. Up until this point, there haven't been many investors that have focused on diagnostics. And Northpond is probably one of the few investors that's consistently been doing that for a long period of time. No, not everyone thought about it because it's sometimes hard to understand. The commercialization of diagnostics is relatively challenging. Physicians actually tend to do a pretty good job of diagnosing disease. The clinical gestalt and the clinical reasoning that physicians possess, oftentimes 89% of the time, they get it right without ever needing any type of diagnostic. But with COVID, because the disease looks so similar to a lot of other diseases that we know of, bacterial pneumonia, the flu, but it has a different treatment paradigm. The importance of molecular diagnostics to help guide decision-making, I think, really, really became important in this pandemic. And I think as a result of that, it's boosted interest in diagnostics, which I think is a good thing. Diagnostics companies that before would have a lot of trouble attracting financing, attracting a team, attracting talent to help bring a diagnostic to market, now I think because of this pandemic have a much better opportunity to do that, because a larger section of the world now understands why diagnostics are so important in healthcare, why it's so important to know exactly what you're treating, know the genetic makeup of the disease that you're treating, because that obviously helps guide in treatment decision making, but also, as we're seeing with the pandemic, and help guides policymakers in understanding how widespread is the disease, where is it going, and hopefully, we'll see, but hopefully helps them make better decisions, make better public policy decisions about the economy, about the country. So that's probably like one of the biggest things that we've noticed in Northpond is the kind of this improved recognition of diagnostics as being important. Another thing that really kind of come up as a result of the pandemic is just the reliance that large parts of the healthcare system have on hospital capacity. Now, obviously, when it was like late March and April of 2020, and many people, both within epidemiology circles as well as in public policy circles, were really concerned about hospital capacity and that we would not have enough hospital beds to treat all the patients with COVID-19 who had it. And so what they did was they converted a lot of hospital beds from kind of their traditional use to specifically ring-fenced for COVID-19 patients. And that was good, right? Like, we needed to do it. As a result of that, we were, at least here in Massachusetts, we really didn't see the spike that we were afraid of. And so as a result, at least from what I understand, the patients who needed acute hospitalization for COVID were actually able to get it. And thus they were able to get the treatment that they needed in order to recover from the illness. But what happened as well is because they took those beds away from their traditional use to devote to COVID, a lot of other things that happen in our healthcare system ground to a halt. So at MGH, the hospital that I practiced at and I trained at, a good proportion of the hospital beds are actually devoted to cancer patients getting bone marrow transplants or getting CAR T therapies for particular lymphomas and leukemias. A good proportion of those hospital beds are devoted to patients getting experimental treatments, and those beds got taken away, right, by COVID. So, for large parts of the therapeutic sector in healthcare, research ground to a halt because you just couldn't put when a patient gets an experimental therapy as part of a clinical trial, they need to be hospitalized because they need to be monitored very closely. A lot of data needs to be collected. A lot of labs need to be drawn. And if you don't have the beds to actually do that, you just can't run a clinical trial. And this is even bigger when it comes to just treatments of disease with therapies that are approved by the FDA and that we have strong data, like CAR T cells, like certain bone marrow transplant regimens. We couldn't do those either. If someone gets a CAR T therapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, they need to be hospitalized when they get that cell therapy, just in case if there are certain kind of rare side effects that occur with it, and that if they do happen, the person needs to be in a hospital so that they get the care they need immediately. It's called cytokine release syndrome. That's one of the kind of rare side effects of cell therapies. If you can't put that person in a hospital, you can't give them cell therapy. You just can't do it because it's just not safe to do it in an outpatient setting or at home. You have to admit them. So I think the pandemic is really kind of, at least to me, and I think to a lot of my peers, really emphasized how important hospitals are to the healthcare system, how important they are to research, because we need that capacity in order to conduct certain experiments and also to treat people. And when the capacity isn't there because of a pandemic like COVID, just can't do that. So those are just two things that I think I've noticed, very specifically about how the pandemic has affected life sciences innovation, life sciences entrepreneurship. Obviously, there are a whole host of other changes that have happened that are broader around the economy, around fundraising. But yeah, those are just two things I think are, at least I found very interesting. And I would not have expected those things to happen with the pandemic. And we're still trying to deal with it, right? We're trying to make sure that the patients who need the treatments that, for cell therapies or bone marrow transplants, or patients who are enrolled in clinical trials, can actually get those agents. But on the flip side, the increased interest in diagnostics, I hope, will stick around for a long period of time. And hopefully that will catalyze additional innovation in molecular diagnostics. And hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll see even more diagnostics that'll help guide our decision-making for a whole host of diseases.
Cool, perfect. We're actually getting some questions coming in from
Awesome.
the participants. Let's see, the first one was from Akash. Did you want to ask your question to Dr. Gandhi?
Mm-hmm. So I'm Akash, and my question is, with your focus on increasing diagnostic technologies, what would you say is the biggest barrier to entry for new companies or new startups that want to focus in diagnostics, and how would you get around that, the block? Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I think those barriers are still there, even with COVID. The biggest one that I've seen with diagnostics is clinical adoption. So when I said this earlier, but doctors are actually pretty good at diagnosing disease. And so they may not be as good in diagnosing some specific subvariant of a disease that you'll need help with molecular diagnostics, but by and large, saying whether someone has viral or bacterial pneumonia, for example, clinical gestalt actually is pretty good at helping to distinguish either of those two things. And so the biggest barrier that I've seen in diagnostics is getting at clinical adoption. It's how do you design a diagnostic that provides the right information to the right patient at the right time, so that the outcome of the diagnostic actually becomes clinically actionable. And that's where it's hard. It's hard to make a diagnostic that's truly clinically actionable because, again, it has to be there at the right time. It has to correctly identify the right patient where the physician or the provider can actually change management based on that diagnostic in order to help that person. And so some of those barriers come from, so some of the barriers to clinical adoption, some of it's scientific, where we just don't know enough about the pathophysiology and the natural history of the disease in order to know whether or not a diagnostic actually becomes clinically actionable. Just don't know. Heart failure is actually a great example of this, where we just don't understand enough about the disease of heart failure to really specify subtypes of heart failure and say, okay, for this group of patients, this treatment is best. For this group of patients, this treatment is best. We're still not there yet. We're working on it, but we're not there yet. So there's some scientific challenges. There are also some reimbursement challenges with diagnostics. If you're thinking about a diagnostic that's used within a hospital setting, then the hospital actually has to pay for that diagnostic out of their own pocket because they get a fixed sum of money. They get a DRG payment from a payer in order to cover all of the costs associated with the hospitalization of that particular person. So if it's hospital-based, if it's a hospital-based diagnostic, then you have to think about getting the cost of the diagnostic down significantly so that the hospital doesn't lose money on a patient when they use that particular diagnostic. And if the diagnostic is used in the outpatient setting, then the physician or the clinician won't use the diagnostic unless they can actually get paid for it by a payer. And so making sure that the payer actually covers that diagnostic and actually pays a sum to the clinician sufficient for it to make financial sense for the clinician to continue using it, that ends up being a big challenge. And we've actually seen these challenges a lot within infectious disease and within oncology, where with infectious disease, we have lots of really high-tech tools for diagnosing bacterial infections earlier, determining antibiotic susceptibility profiles, but they're very expensive. It requires next generation sequencing technologies. It requires very, very detailed preparation steps. And so it's hard for that diagnostic to get used because it's so expensive. And so hospitals and physicians will reserve use for only very specific circumstances, and thus it doesn't make it financially feasible for the company making the diagnostic to continue making it because the use is so limited. In oncology, it becomes a major issue for profiling patients with cancer as to what the mutational status of their tumors are, because again, by and large, payers still are not covering advanced molecular diagnostics for oncology. There are a few that are being covered. There's a local company here in town, Foundation Medicine. They have a panel called Foundation One that's covered by a lot of payers, but a lot of them aren't. And so an oncologist doesn't want to order this test, not because it doesn't provide actionable information, it does, but that the oncologist would then have to pass that cost on to the patient, and the cost could be in the thousands of dollars, and a lot of people just can't afford it. So it's that clinical adoption piece that ends up being the biggest barrier to diagnostics, as opposed to say like therapeutics, right? Where if you can prove the drug works, it does what it says it does, by and large, payers will reimburse for it, Medicare will reimburse for it. It'll get used. But diagnostics, it's challenging because that clinical adoption piece often isn't there for a lot of companies and for a lot of products.
Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect.
Absolutely.
We're having a couple questions asking about the COVID. One of them was from Joe. If you want to ask a question and give a quick introduction as well.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. No, my question was just because there's been some information coming out that potentially there's like an autoimmune component to um, the COVID-19. I wondered your thoughts on biologics and using like immunosuppressants and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't want to take the conversation off track either.
No worries.
Apologize.
No worries. I'll say this. So I'm not a rheumatologist, and I'm not an infectious disease specialist. So I'm probably not qualified to comment on the particulars of like drugs for use in COVID. But I will say that most infectious diseases have some autoimmune component, and not really. Autoimmune is probably not the. There's an immune component to most infectious diseases, where if you see like the phenomenon of sepsis, where you see significant release of cytokine in response to an infectious insult, and that release of cytokine can lead to a systemic inflammatory response that leads to very, very severe consequences for some proportion of patients. So we see that a lot in a lot of infectious diseases, COVID obviously being one of them. And so there probably is a role for immunosuppressants. It's unclear exactly which ones work. Obviously, I'm sure all of you have seen about hydroxychloroquine. The data on hydroxychloroquine are mixed at best about its immunosuppressive abilities to help patients with COVID. There's been other data on another drug, an IL-23 inhibitor called tocilizumab. That also, some data show that it works, some data show it doesn't work, and there are of course side effects with all of these additional drugs that you add on. So I think the best answer is there may be a role for it. It may be helpful, but we're just not sure yet. But what I will say is that diagnosing sepsis and recognizing sepsis earlier and then acting upon it appropriately with fluids, with pressors to raise blood pressure, that's standard of care, and that does work, and that is proven. And going into one of these hospitals, you'll see that pretty much all of the patients that are in ICUs who have COVID, they're getting that treatment because that's really directed at supporting the body, supporting the vital organs as this inflammatory insult manifests itself as with the disease.
Thank you.
Perfect. We have our next question from Elizabeth, if you want to ask your question.
You can ask it for Cindy if she's not.
Okay. Yeah, maybe she's not here. Okay, so her question was, can you comment on the outlook for non-COVID related therapeutic companies looking to raise funds in the near term and medium term?
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. We have not seen a drop-off in companies raising funds. I haven't seen a drop-off in companies being successful with their fundraises. I think there's a subset of investors that, because of the financial consequences associated with the pandemic, the volatility in the stock market, falling asset values, they've had to take a hard look at their investment strategy within venture and to try to figure out where it fits in. So that definitely has happened and is happening. But as I'm sure you've seen, there have been loads and loads of press releases about major biotech venture capital firms raising new funds, getting additional funds added to existing funds. And so I think, kind of broadly speaking, it probably is slowing down a bit, but that's just because the pace at which biotech financing was happening in 2018 and 2019 was so brisk. I think 2019 broke records for the amount of financing, the number of deals, the number of investors that were involved in biotech. And so, yeah, 2020 is going to be a lot slower than 2019, but we were starting at such a high level with 2019 that it was going to be tough to beat 2019 anyway. But we're seeing the markets completely open. We're still actively investing. I think on my diligence sheet, we have, I think, 8 companies that we're actively looking at right now. So I say keep going, because there are loads of investors, particularly now even that the stock market has started to recover. There are now a lot of investors who are looking to get back into the venture ecosystem.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I heard connection was just unstable, so it's all good. I'm sure that worked out. We then have Bradley, if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Sydney. I'm Brad. I'm an incoming master's student in biomedical engineering at Case. Shaan, so it seems you've had a somewhat nonlinear career/education path. How would you reflect on that? And do you think there are some experiences you've had that have been super beneficial, or some that you might think you could have?
Yeah. Interesting question. I wouldn't change anything in my path, frankly. I think all of the experiences I've had in my career, albeit it's been relatively short. I graduated 13 years ago from college, from Case, so hasn't been too long that I've been working. And a big number of the years that I've spent after I graduated from college, I was still in education. Probably the best experiences I've had have been ones where they have taught me a lot, and they taught me a lot of different things. So I think one of reflecting back on my again, albeit short career, there are aspects to what I do currently that I didn't really gain from kind of formal training in science. I would say actually probably one of the most beneficial things I ever did was do a debate in forensics in high school and actually at Case as well. Because a lot of what I do is speaking. Really, I'm speaking to you right now, speaking to potential clients, speaking to companies, presenting my ideas at meetings. And so like that skill is something that can be learned, but it's not something that traditionally gets taught in formal education or actually in a lot of jobs. And so I think, again, just like reflecting back, it's like, what are those like additional skill sets that are outside of kind of pure technical specs, technical understanding that allow people to appreciate how much you know and how rigorous your analysis is. So yeah, I wouldn't change anything. I'm glad I did certain random things because it exposed me to those skill sets that I think have made me definitely a better physician when I was practicing, and then a better investor. And I think public speaking is probably one of the biggest ones.
Okay, perfect. We have time for probably a couple more questions.
Okay.
Next on the list is from Michael, if you want to ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Hi, this is Mike Bruckman. I'm the CEO of a startup company that spun out of Case Western Reserve University. And you'd already kind of addressed the general question that I had earlier was, given the volatility of the markets, how interested do you think VCs and angel investors would be to invest? And like you mentioned, I'm sure it's based on a case-to-case basis, depending on how stable the fund is and so on. But I am kind of curious if you're seeing a shift in new companies approaching VCs and angels now that everything has to be done digitally. There are no in-person meetings that can really be had.
Yep. And
how your firm has approached that issue.
It's an interesting question. I think I saw this on Twitter probably about a month ago. A couple journalists in health tech asked the question of venture capitalists of, have you invested in a company where you have never met the CEO in person, right? All of your interactions have occurred over some video conferencing or over the phone or over email. At that time, this was I think about a month ago, at that time, I don't think anyone responded in the affirmative. But I think now, as this is continuing, as we're looking at how state governments and the federal government are thinking about how our economy reopens, I think we're all just going to have to get used to it. That maybe for a lot of investments, the only way we're going to have interactions it's through like video conferencing or through the telephone, and so I think it represents both a challenge as well as an opportunity. The challenge is when you're dealing with a pure digital medium to present your product and to present your idea, you just have to be very, very crisp and very, very efficient about how you describe things. Because obviously a lot of things get lost when you're interacting with someone virtually instead of when you're interacting with them in person. You don't pick up on a lot of body language. You may not be able to hear like changes in tone because it's the limitation. That's a limitation we're faced with virtual interactions, and so it's a challenge because previously you could use nonverbal cues and body language to communicate things. You could also pick up on cues from your audience and tailor your talk and your communications appropriately based on that. Here, you can't do that anymore. And so I think that becomes a challenge of just making sure that all of your communications, that you're hyper vigilant about what's going on in your communication, and that you're always thinking about how to make those communications better. I will say, though, that there is an opportunity here because there are many, I would say particularly within venture, there are many firms, I'm proud to say we're not one of them, but there are many firms that have a geographic bias where they only invest in companies that are within driving distance of their head office, or they really value having that in-person meeting. Because no one really can meet in person anymore, I think the opportunity to talk to a broader array of investors, and then at the same time for an investor, the opportunity to talk to a broader array of companies, I think, has only increased. And so, whereas previously, if you were in a particular city and you were far away from, say, Boston or San Francisco or New York,
like Cleveland, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. You're now just as far away from me as a company that's 2 blocks away, because I can't visit them. They can't visit me. So I'm going to have to interact with them over video conferencing, even if they're just down the street from me. And so you're now on the same playing field as a company that's 2 or 3 blocks away. And so I think that's a massive opportunity to get in front of a lot of investors that previously it may have been a lot harder to get in front of.
Well, that's promising and exciting from our perspective, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Shaan.
Perfect. We have another question kind of going along with the COVID again. So why should venture capitals actually increase the amount they bet during the COVID-19 downturn with so much money on the sidelines? This seems to be the best time to start a company, but people think the venture capitals are being predatory / withholding, which seems non-intuitive. Okay.
No, I've heard that criticism before. I think there's probably a little kernel of truth in it. I think really the origin of that is in 2018 and 2019, there were banner years for, and again, I can only speak for life sciences venture capital. Obviously, tech venture capital is completely different industry. The metrics they use, the way in which they value investment is very different from the way we do it in life sciences. I would say in life sciences, 2018 and 2019, again, were banner years for investment. And so, yeah, there was a bit of a pullback when the pandemic initially broke out in the United States. And I think that pullback was just because there was so much exuberance in the markets at the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020, that any change at all in aggregate demand in the economy, any change at all in the money supply would probably adversely affect how easily it would be to invest. I mean, we were seeing massive fundraisers, $150 million, $300 million, like absurd amounts of money that were going into companies, because that was the state of the ecosystem. That there were so many investors that were eager to get into life sciences. We had a lot of breakthroughs over the last decade in biotech. I mean, again, most prominently immuno-oncology, but also even alternative ways of treating patients. So cell therapy, gene therapy. We had the first cell therapy approved for leukemia. We had the first gene therapy for a form of congenital blindness. We had the first RNA therapies that Alnylam started, that Alnylam created for amyloidosis. So there was just so much enthusiasm, so much exuberance that anything that would change it probably would have adversely affected how people could, how easily people could invest. So I think that's probably the biggest reason why things slowed down considerably in venture. Because if you think about it, the investments that I make at Northpond, I'm going to have to wait a long period of time to see the investment pan out. Minimum 5 years, probably more like 8 to 10 years. So the perturbations in the market now, compared to when I actually would be looking for some sort of investment return, it's 10 years from now. So what's going on today probably doesn't have that much of an impact on what's going to happen 10 years from now, but it could. And because of how systemic the pandemic has affected our economy, a lot of people just got really skittish. And then, of course, some investors saw it as an opportunity to try to bid down companies, try to kind of renegotiate terms. But what I've found is that fundamentally, at least for the companies that we're investing in, we haven't renegotiated those terms, because the fundamental value proposition of the drug they're making, the platform they're developing, that hasn't changed. Like, the science hasn't changed. The need hasn't changed. Those patients that need those treatments still are out there, and they still need that help. So when we do our valuation decision, we haven't seen a difference. But of course, there are always going to be some investors that are maybe much more sensitive to what's going on in the economy.
Gotcha. Perfect. And then maybe this might be our last question.
Okay.
If Gemma wants to ask hers.
Hey, Cindy, I think you might have skipped
Yeah,
my
for
question.
Gemma?
Oh, sorry.
Gemma?
Gemma, yeah, sorry.
Gemma, should I ask my question?
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead, Gemma. Thank you.
Okay. Shaan, I'm interested if you are focused only on US markets, or you are looking for investments globally, given that the health system is so different in each region. And also, I'm interested to know what are the risks involved in investments, also given the legislation and the changes that happen in the health system pretty often.
Yeah. So I'll answer the first question. So we invest globally. We have, I would say, a majority of our businesses are located in the United States. We do have businesses that are outside the United States. We have a company that's actually working on sepsis diagnostics there in Australia. We have a clinical trial management company that's located in Ireland. We have an oncology diagnostics company that's half in North America, half in India. So we invest globally. Moving on to your second question, it is challenging to predict how changes in legislation will affect the healthcare industry. I would say where we are on the life sciences side, as opposed to, say, the health services side, we're a little more insulated from those changes, because a lot of the risk that we take is scientific risk. We do take execution risk to a certain extent, but most of the risk that we take is scientific risk, of whether or not the pathway we're looking at is actually real, whether the drug that we're making actually modulates the disease and actually helps patients. That's fundamentally a biological question, and that's something that, as much as governments may try to change it, it's not going to change fundamental biology. So a lot of the risks that we take are insulated from governmental and legislative action. I will say though, we have had to start increasing our research and our understanding of how government action affects us, because of course there are a lot of discussions around pricing of drugs. There are certain economic realities of making novel therapeutics where it takes a certain amount of time, it costs a certain amount of money, and the risk is still significant that the biology does not work. And so that's a risk that we have to be prepared to take, but it's also a risk that if we lose, if we flip the coin in its tails, we have to accept that we lose all that money. And the hope is that for the one or two companies, or for the one or two drugs that actually do work and actually do get into the hands of patients, that the proceeds from that would then cover a lot of our losses in other areas. I mean, we're seeing this right now with COVID, where the sums are astronomical for developing vaccines against it, where we're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to make a vaccine, all of the formulation, all of the manufacturing that it takes. And so someone has to pay for that. And so, yeah, I would say we're thinking about it. It hasn't really progressed to a point where it's fundamentally changing how we think about our business, but absolutely. Restrictions in national formularies for medication, restrictions on the pricing that can be, that a drug can be charged, that's of course going to affect our business. We just haven't seen it yet, but it absolutely could happen in the future, and it's something that we have to keep a lookout for.
Perfect. With that, thank you so much. We're running out of time. It's been a quick hour. Thank you for answering our questions, and I'll be handing it over back to Professor Goldberg for closing statements. Thank you.
Great. Cindy, thank you so much for moderating, and thanks to everybody for joining. It was nice, Gemma, to have you from Stuttgart. We're seeing a growing number of alums and students and recent grads joining these sessions, and we're going to continue them over the summer. So even though the semester has officially concluded, we will still be doing these sessions, and it's really a great way, Shaan, to reconnect with alums like you. We do look forward to welcoming you back on campus at some point.
Yes, hopefully.
But this is great. We really appreciate you sharing, and I know in conversations with Todd and others about what we're doing at the Veale Institute and connecting you with students and folks like Mike Bruckman who have spin-outs, there's a lot that we can learn by engaging with you. So thank you for your willingness to.
You're so welcome. This has been great.
Great. So just a couple of announcements about a future session. So tomorrow, same time, same channel, we have Tim Schigel, who's an alum, 1989 alum, who's a partner in Refinery Ventures, will be with us. So it's sort of a venture capital, private equity week. And then next week, it's a little more diverse in terms of topics and speakers. On Tuesday, also at 1 o'clock, we've got a trio of folks, Dan Moore, Zach Ponsky, and Mata Helu, that were involved in developing a quick-to-market ventilator product here. And Brad, who's on the call, is going to be our student moderating it. So it's a really fascinating story about how an entrepreneur, two entrepreneurs and a physician came together with an idea to try to address the shortage of ventilators right here in Cleveland, Ohio. So if you can join us for that. Then next Wednesday, we have two sessions. We're going to start at 9 a.m. With some friends in Tanzania who are going to talk. One of the things that we like to do is share perspectives on what's happening with entrepreneurships around the world. So Ivy Petzinger, who's an alum of Case Western Reserve, who's a recent Peace Corps grad, is going to moderate a session with Benjamin and Bernice Fernandez, who actually hosted a group of students, including Ivy and myself, in 2018, where we looked at social entrepreneurship in Tanzania. So that'll be the morning. And then in the afternoon, we'll be back at 1 o'clock, our regular time, with Rachel Paul, who's an alum who's doing some really interesting work in the nutrition space. And then next Thursday, the 28th, we're going to talk about impact investing with a Cleveland native, Sarah Morgenstern, who's working as a principal with Flourish Ventures. So 4 sessions next week, 1 more this week. We'll keep you busy as we're chained to our desks, although seemingly with the weather getting better and things changing a bit. People are getting outside more. So again, Shaan, thank you for doing this
Thank
today.
you.
It was really wonderful. And Cindy, thank you for moderating, and thanks everybody for joining.